If you guys have been playing fantasy football for any number of years, you've probably heard the term regression, statistics that maybe don't make any sense to you. One of those statistics that I think we're going to be talking about today is catchable targets. And I got Ryan Heath here from Fantasy Points, who wrote, in my opinion, one of the more underrated articles that I've read from him. I've talked about a number of his works on the channel so far, including, the age curves article that he wrote last year. But today specifically, we're going to be breaking down kind of a statistically significant article that you kind of broke down here, which is catchable targets, kind of diving into the process of it and how we can kind of use it to determine, maybe positive regression candidates this year, guys that maybe overperformed in 2023 and that kind of thing. So Ryan, I'll let you introduce yourself, kind of plug any work that you're working on right now, and we'll get into this because I basically just read this article and I thought it was so good that I wanted to have you on. That was basically the process of how this got going here.
Yeah, hey, I appreciate that. Thank you. Yeah, I'm Ryan Heath. You can follow me on Twitter at RyanJ_Heath. And all of my written work is on fantasypoints.com. This offseason have mostly been writing the statistically significant series, of which this Catchable Targets article was a part of it. Just kind of highlighting all the different stats available in the Fantasy Points data suite. So if you're a data nerd like I am, I would definitely check that out. I think you'd really enjoy it.
Yeah, and everybody who follows this channel knows that I'm a data nerd as well. So basically, like you said, you broke down the statistically significant series. Catchable targets was the focus of this article. And basically, we're kind of just going to go through and explain the process of what you kind of dug into and kind of some of the heuristics that you can draw from this that we can kind of apply to our fantasy draft. So this is a real nerdy video. I mean, if you guys are 5 sleepers to draft in your fantasy league, like maybe this isn't the video for you, but this one should be a lot of fun. So let's start with catchable targets and the whole concept behind it. So I'm sure anybody who watches football is understanding that certain targets are just not available to catch. Like they're throwaways, they're inaccurate balls, it's tight defense, whatever the case is. You kind of outlined in the article that a catchable target is actually quantifiable. 2.31 fantasy points is kind of what we can expect from a catchable target. 1.78 fantasy points on average is what you can expect from a non-catchable target. And then you also kind of talked about average depth of target factors in, because obviously like a 2-yard screen pass is more catchable than a 20-yard deep route down the field. And I thought that was right away kind of drew me into the article, because part of the unquantifiable thing about fantasy football is understanding why a 150 target season from Deontay Johnson, for example, doesn't feel like it helped your fantasy team as much as like 105 targets from Brandon Ayuk helped your fantasy team this year.
Absolutely. Yeah. And part of that is just going to be the catchable target rate of each of those receivers. So for example, if you just sort in the Fantasy Points data suite or wherever else, just by total targets last year, yeah, you've got like your CeeDee Lambs and your Tyreek Hills at the top, but then you've also got your Devontae Adams and your Garrett Wilsons. It's like those guys were fine in fantasy, but they certainly didn't perform exactly how we wish they would have given the volume, right? And catchable target rate is a part of that, right? A lot of those targets that they were getting just were not available to catch at all. The quarterback didn't give those players any sort of chance. And at Fantasy Points, we chart every single one of those. So we know exactly how many catchable targets each wide receiver had. So that lets us do some really interesting statistical analysis and just be a little more close to what's actually going on the football field, which is always fun for me. Like I'm the guy that lives in the spreadsheets and stuff, but if I'm being fed the stats that help me know, like, okay, this was a real actual target that he could have caught, that's even better for me. It just makes my life easier.
Yeah, absolutely. Because like I said, it's hard to quantify, but you know it when you feel it. When you got Deontay Johnson in your fantasy lineup like 2 years ago or whatever year that was, where he just was peppered with targets and he was not helping your fantasy team, didn't score a touchdown or whatever that happened that year, that you know it, you feel it, you know that those targets are not worth nearly as much as a Jalen Waddle on the Miami Dolphins target is worth, because the offensive scheme, the quarterback play, everything kind of factors in. The accuracy, obviously, of the throw factors into what that receiver can do with that target. And speaking of, like, this whole article is based just on the heuristic that I think every regular Joe Schmo fantasy player knows, which is we want wide receivers who have better quarterbacks than wide receivers who don't have good quarterbacks, right? Like, and you documented here with the catchable targets per game versus receiving yards per game. Like I have the graphic on the screen right now. If you kind of want to just go through that and talk about how we can kind of take away what that exactly means.
Absolutely, yeah. So, kind of as you might expect, the more catchable targets that a team is going to average, the more overall production they're going to have in the receiving game, right? That makes sense. And it's not just that it's correlated, right? It is a closer relationship between catchable targets and receiving yards than it is just between overall team targets and receiving yards. So, that tells you right there that we're getting closer to what's actually happening on the football field, right? So, yeah, I think just at the team level, we can already start to see the importance of this. Like if you were a receiver with a 20% target share on the Bears or the Titans last year, that was actually worse than like a 15% target share on the Cowboys, just because of the insanely different volumes of catchable targets on those two teams.
Yeah, which is a wild concept to somebody like me who, like, when I first started getting into fantasy and really getting diehard into the spreadsheets and stuff, you start drafting like you play in targets per route run leagues rather than you play in like, you have to factor that in. Like you can look at Gabe Davis, for example, and be like a 20% target share. I don't want that guy, or whatever his target share has been over his career. But then you're like, but he plays with Josh Allen. He's going to have spike weeks. It's something that we have to factor in. So that's sometimes the balancing act that we have between just relying solely on the volume and then also kind of factoring in how that volume comes about. And as you've kind of broken down, I've seen some of your tweets lately have been like the stickiness of stats over year at certain positions. And of course, at running back and at wide receiver, some of the stickiest stats we have are just like the previous year's targets, the previous year's fantasy production, the previous year's yards. That stuff usually means they're a good player, and that kind of translates into the next season. But this stuff kind of takes just like a raw target total into the next kind of to the next level, because it factors in how good their quarterback and how talented of a player even they might potentially be.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, you'll see it even in that predictiveness analysis. Catchable targets in the previous year are more predictive than just raw targets, right? So, yeah, I guess even more support for the idea here that we should be looking at catchable targets. They are important. And I would say the place that they're the most important in terms of actionable takeaways for fantasy football going into this year is especially deep, right? Because yes, it's harder for a quarterback to throw a catchable target deeper down the field. What that does is it creates this bigger separation or this bigger swing in potential fantasy points between a catchable or an uncatchable target if you're really far down the field. So a catchable target over 20 yards down the field is worth like 4 fantasy points on average, which is insane, right? And that's double what just any old, like whether it's catchable or not target, unspecified target is worth 20 yards down the field. So the deep accuracy, especially for a player's quarterback, is so important. And it's something that we can see kind of vary pretty wildly from year to year. Maybe a quarterback is going to attempt like 20 to 30 downfield passes, like 20 plus yards down the field every season. Whether 25 of those are accurate or 10 of those are accurate makes a huge difference to the fantasy production of that team. So it's really, really important, I think, to kind of get in the weeds there and figure out which teams could just have a lot better luck, which receivers could have a lot better luck in the coming year based on last year's results.
Yeah, because like you said, like there's not really any year-over-year consistency to this. It'd be one thing if every single year we looked at like the deep accuracy rating and it was Patrick Mahomes and Josh Allen and the guys that we would all expect to be there. But like just in terms of tendency too, like last year, the leaders in deep attempts per game were Will Levis and Baker Mayfield. Like not quarterbacks that I'm sure many of us like really wanted receivers attached to them. Obviously, Mike Evans was good last year, but the guys that we assume probably are the great deep passers and the ones we want guys attached to, like sometimes aren't pushing the ball downfield as much, but when they do, obviously they're catchable targets, and that kind of would factor in as well to this whole kind of piece of analysis. the thing that I really took away from this article, the first like takeaway, the one that I wanted to scroll down to immediately, which I'm sure everybody else who was reading the article wanted to scroll down to immediately, was who are the guys that overperformed and who are the guys that underperformed, the guys that were maybe regression candidates and the guys that were kind of positive regression candidates. Because as you kind of mentioned, like you have like an expected value of your deep targets depending on if they're catchable or not. And some guys just run hot, like for whatever reason, like the DB fell over most of the time they were running a deep route or whatever, and they got lucky and they ran hot on the deep routes. And then conversely, there's plenty of guys that didn't run hot on deep routes, whether it was their quarterback was under pressure, like I think you detail in the article as well, or they just, whatever reason, the pass didn't connect. So if you want to talk about some of the guys that, the stat that you created and some of the guys that kind of over and underperformed in that.
Sure. So yeah, kind of starting with this, I created basically depth adjusted catchable target rate, because as we set up top, yes, catchable targets are very affected by the depth of those targets. So basically what I did was I just took average catchable target rates at different depths all over the field and kind of smushed all of that together to create a stat that I could apply to each player to say, considering how deep their targets were, did they get really lucky or really unlucky in terms of uncatchable targets? So the guys who got the luckiest, honestly, were a lot of the most productive players in the league, the most productive receivers in the league. It was like your Tyreek Hills, your Brandon Ayuk's, your CeeDee Lamb's, your Nico Collins's. And I don't want to look at that and say, okay, clearly they can't do that again, right? Because all of those guys are in these great offenses, are in these great passing attacks. Half of those are Shanahan style offenses that I personally think have kind of broken the league offensively. So I certainly don't want to bet against that continuing. But we also have names here like Cortland Sutton or like a KJ Osborne, which is kind of funny. He's on a different team now anyway. Or even a Jaden Reed, where it's like, okay, they were running a little bit hot in terms of their catchable target rate. So maybe that's a reason to ease off a little bit. But I think the more like concrete way to apply this is in the other direction, right? So who got really unlucky in terms of their catchable target rate based on where they were seeing them on the field? So I'm just ignoring Jonathan Mingo's name at the top of this because I will not defend Jonathan Mingo. I don't care what any number says. I will not do it. But some interesting names do come up here. We've got Darnell Mooney, right? Remember a few years ago, Darnell Mooney was really productive. Now he's on a Kirk Cousins offense, right? There's definitely targets up for grabs there after Drake London and Kyle Pitts. Mooney's like, there could be worse best ball clicks, right? If you're trying to fill out your wide receivers. Demario Douglas is interesting. A lot of his targets came in shorter areas of the field, but he still apparently got fairly unlucky in terms of catchable targets based on that. So maybe a reason to lean Douglas over like a Javon Baker or a Kendrick Bourne if you're picking through Patriots wide receivers later on. And then we get to like the really interesting guys. Marquise Brown, for example, moving to a Patrick Mahomes offense after getting so unlucky on these uncatchable targets last year is very, very interesting. Deontay Johnson, Christian Watson, I might go even more into detail on those guys later, but those are some of my favorite players to draft this year. So yeah, there's a lot here in terms of guys that could just get a little bit luckier or not even get luckier, just be less unlucky and take a step forward in fantasy this year based on what we're seeing with this catchable target rate over expected.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of players on this list that you just look at and you're like, oh yeah, I had him in fantasy last year. Really wish I didn't draft him. Like Marquise Brown and Deontay Johnson, Christian Watson, like Terry McLaurin, Gabe Davis, like Chris Godwin. Like you just felt like these guys should have been better than they were last year, based on like especially Godwin. Like as a Bucs fan, I like Godwin got targets, like he was getting work. And the fact like he doesn't really perform that like below expectation here, but you could tell that he kind of did run a little bit cold just when you were watching the games and some of the stuff that happened there. So yeah, I think like you mentioned, like the cemented like actual takeaway is that like the guys who run cold this year are not going to probably be the guys who run cold next year, at least not the exact list. Like maybe one or two guys show up again. I also think Two, it's interesting that Quentin Johnston shows up on a list of people who ran hot in 2023, which is the funniest thing I've ever heard in my life, because I don't think any part of his season was running hot. But yeah, I mean, to me, this was just so interesting again, because I totally nerd out on this stuff. I look at this and I'm like, okay, like this is where the edges are, because the way that like underdog is, the way that the landscape in fantasy is now versus when I started playing fantasy, the edges are like to the point that I think, like, this might be a hot take and maybe this is bad for business as someone who makes fantasy content. The average fantasy player could probably print out underdog ADP, show up to their home league draft and dominate.
Oh yeah. Yeah. I've felt that way for a couple years, actually. Yeah. It's a low key cheat code for anyone looking to skip some of the homework there. Yeah.
No, literally. It's just because underdog ADP has thousands of inputs of people who are spending a lot of money on drafting best ball teams. And this data is refined to a point that when I started playing fantasy, if you wanted to do a mock draft, you hopped in an ESPN or an NFL fantasy or a Yahoo lobby, and the computers were taking kickers in round 6. And that was the ADP we were drafting off of. And that was the ADP that we were giving advice based on as well. So now we're just like, it's totally a different landscape where we have to find these micro edges. We have to find a place to try and realize that, to me, still the biggest edge on the market right now is over and underreacting to what happened the year previous. And what happened the year previous for a lot of these guys that underperformed was you were disappointed. Whatever you thought you were getting out of them, you probably didn't get. And especially when you look at a guy like Marquise Brown, for example, where his situation completely changed, especially to an area of an offense where we expect him to run hot more often than not. Like, he's more likely to be on the other side of the spectrum, just knowing the quarterback that he plays with and the offense that he's going to be a part of. So I'm sure you'll probably mention him at some point again, but that to me is the big actionable takeaway from here. And you also had some misconceptions listed here about what like kind of catchable targets mean, which I kind of wanted to go over as well. And a lot of people, I think, when they hear the term catchable targets, would imagine that like receivers aren't getting open as part of why they're not getting catchable targets. And misconception 2 that you have here is like a quarterback would hurt a receiver via a poor catchable target throw rate in one season, and he's likely to do it again, which we kind of already addressed. It's not sticky year over year, but kind of talk about the idea that wide receivers, like their separation level doesn't really have any impact on if their targets are going to be catchable or not.
Yeah, so I don't really know where this idea originally came from, because this is one of the few things that kind of gets blasted at me on Twitter anytime I say the word catchable targets, is that's not real. Like, it's just if they're getting open or not. But you can literally just chart something like ESPN's open score, which is a separation metric, against catchable target rate, and see that is very not true. Like Deontay Johnson, for example, has led the league in open score like each of the past 5 years or something like that. He's the best separator in the league, yet he's had awful catchable target rates the last couple of years in these just disgusting Steelers offenses that he's been stuck in, right? So it's very obviously and very clearly possible to be a good separator and still not get catchable targets, right? It is very much on the quarterback. I would say primarily catchable target rate is a stat about your quarterback's play and about your average depth of target, basically. And then, kind of moving into the quarterback play there. Yes, I think there are quarterbacks who we very clearly should not expect, like, oh, he's going to take a huge step forward and he's going to be near the top of the league in catchable throw rate. I wouldn't say that about, I don't know, a Zach Wilson or a Kenny Pickett or whatever, right? No, I'm not making that claim that like the worst quarterbacks could suddenly have way better catchable throw rates that will just suddenly make their receivers much more viable. But what I am saying is a kind of the quarterbacks in the middle of that, like a Jordan Love, for example. I wouldn't be surprised if Jordan Love was top 3 in catchable throw rate next year, or if he was bottom 10, right? I don't think anyone is going to make that hard of a stance on how accurate will Jordan Love's downfield passes specifically be next year. And we see that in the data. Yeah, it's not at all stable year to year on like a population level at the quarterback level. And Jordan Love's actually a good example. We even have cases where individual wide receivers with relatively similar average depth of targets on the same team with the same QB will have vastly different catchable target rates, right? That's the case with Romeo Doubs and Christian Watson last year. On targets 20 plus yards downfield, Romeo Doubs had like a 75% catchable target rate. That was top 3 or top 4 or something like that, where Watson was, I believe, under 40% or right around there, near the bottom. So there can just be all this variance between receivers, between a quarterback from year to year. So ultimately, I think the takeaway is, yeah, just kind of hold your breath, believe that a lot of these guys who got unlucky last year can in fact see a different type of catchable targets in the following year. They can see the light. Things can get better. Wide receivers aren't destined to last year's catchable target rates whatsoever.
Yeah, I think a good example of that is the number one overperformer on this list is Cortland Sutton, right? His quarterback is Russell Wilson, who's going to be going to George Pickens this year, who I don't know if his catchable target rate was underperforming, but I know he had the same quarterback as Deontay Johnson. And he had Kenny Pickett is probably not an asset to George Pickens' catchable target rate. Either way you slice it, because we don't imagine he's going to be performing very well in that stat to begin with. But knowing that Cortland Sutton overperformed this stat super well is a bull case, I suppose, for a guy like George Pickens, although you did mention that typically a target share on like the Steelers, 20% target share is not as good as a 15% target share on the Cowboys in the article too. So maybe we're going bull and bear case against George Pickens here. A couple other like regression candidates and kind of like players to target that I thought were interesting. You kind of outlined that since 2021, there's a number of guys here that have lost a lot of expected fantasy points to uncatchable deep targets. And Marquise Brown, Chris Olave, some of the guys here listed that you guys can see on the screen. And then you also had specifically last year's guys and both Vikings receivers ranking in the top 4 and that kind of thing. So speaking to this, obviously expected fantasy points per game, as you outlined, a catchable deep target is worth a certain amount, a certain allotment of fantasy points per game. So with some of these guys, is there some that you're highlighting as obvious candidates to see better quarterback play this year, or as obvious candidates to maybe continue that trend, or whatever the case is? Just kind of speaking on these guys, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of guys that immediately just pop out to me, right? So DeAndre Hopkins is one of them. And so will he see better quarterback play? Not necessarily, right? It's still Will Levis. I mean, part of the reason DeAndre Hopkins is so high on this list is, because Will Levis attempted all of these deep passes at one of the highest rates in the league, right? So that's pumping up the volume of DeAndre Hopkins' like expected fantasy points lost to uncatchable deep targets. But look, all we need is just any sort of step forward in year 2 from Will Levis, or even just some variance of him being a little bit better. And I think it's certain that the Titans are going to throw a lot more this year based on everything Brian Callahan has been saying every time he gets in front of a microphone. So DeAndre Hopkins just makes a lot of sense in terms of a really volatile type of role where he's seeing all these downfield targets. We only need a few of those to break the right way, especially if he's seeing even more of them, for him to become like a really big fantasy contributor. And DeAndre Hopkins, like peripheral stats were still very good last year in terms of air yard share, target share, even the yards per out run stuff. All of it was really good. He mostly just had a passing volume problem in Tennessee. So Hopkins is one of the bigger regression candidates I'd point out there. I also think it's worth considering Stefon Diggs. So I know the fantasy community kind of just fell out of love with Stefon Diggs, especially in the second half of last season. I understand it was very painful to have Stefon Diggs on your team down the stretch last year. But look, he is here in the top 11 players in terms of points per game lost to uncatchable deep targets. Some of that was variance. Sorry, he still had over, I believe, a 30% target share in the back half of the season. He was commanding the targets. A lot of the time, it was just kind of the Josh Allen prayer down the sideline that no one has any chance of catching, right? So I think Diggs deserves another look, especially with the discount, especially in a new place with CJ Stroud. It's hard to complain about going from Josh Allen to CJ Stroud. So that is who I would point to before maybe we get to some of my biggest targets for the year.
Yeah, and I hope I'm not spoiling one of them, and I feel like I might be, just because you haven't mentioned him yet, and his name has popped up on this list a couple times. But I will say there's two guys that go, I guess, really early in drafts that make me both like kind of concerned and like equally intrigued. And you mentioned Diggs, and not specifically for him, but I'm worried for Nico Collins, because everybody, conversely, you mentioned like everybody's out of love with Stephon Diggs. Everybody's in love with Nico Collins now, right? Because you can pull up any peripheral you want. Nico Collins performed well in it last year. Yards per route run, receiving grade, whatever you want to pull up, reception perception. He crushed last year. But part of me realizes that he did it without Dell on the field for half the season. Noah Brown and Robert Woods were his primary target competition. And Stephon Diggs, even if he is over the hill to some degree, he's going to factor in. He's going to command targets. It's like, and we know these Shanahan style offenses, like Matt LaFleur runs one in Green Bay with Aaron Rodgers and Jordan Love. They're still a bottom of the league pace team, lower half of the league in terms of pass attempts and pass rate over expected. Tua Tagovailoa and the Dolphins are usually about league average. Brock Purdy literally had the 32nd most pass attempts in the NFL last year. So I look at CJ Stroud and Nico Collins in that situation, and everybody's assuming, Nico Collins, year 3 breakout, year 4, he's going to have this monster like top 5 season. And I'm like, dude, Stephon Diggs is going to command targets, even if he's not the same Stephon Diggs of old. And Tank Dell and him were basically neck and neck in terms of their target shares when they were on the field. So Nico is he's the one guy that I keep going back and forth on every single day. I'm like, yep, top 15 player in redraft this week. That's how I feel about him. And then next week, I'm like, you know what? I don't think I would take him until the 2-3 turn. Like, that's where I'm at with Nico. I don't know. I know he's not really related to this discussion, but you bringing up the Diggs stuff, I'm curious what your thoughts are on Nico, knowing all this Diggs information here.
Yeah, it's so hard because I'm in kind of a similar spot to you, where I feel like I find a reason to get really into a Texans wide receiver every single week. It's like a new one. Like CJ Stroud thinks that Tank Dell is like the best wide receiver to ever play in the NFL. If you just listen to him talk at a podium about Tank Dell for a minute, it's quite hilarious. But yeah, I mean, you can even look at CJ Stroud's splits with and without Tank Dell. It's kind of insane. I think CJ Stroud averaged like 14 or 15 fantasy points per game without Tank Dell last year, which is kind of crazy to think about. But it made a huge difference to Stroud's production, and I'm sure he felt that, and I'm sure that's why he feels that way. So, yeah, I mean, I would say that Tank Dell is probably the best value of the three, but yeah, of course, Nico Collins being top 3 in yards per route run and first downs per route run and all the nerdy stuff, and just being the most productive overall. Yeah, my head is also spinning on all these guys. Maybe the correct answer is you just draft all of them, because this is going to be like a historically amazing offense. You obviously don't love when that's priced into all of their ADPs, except for Dell, arguably. But yeah, no, I'm sorry, I don't have like a guide map here on
I'm going to ask
how to
everybody.
navigate the Texans receivers. But yeah, that in my opinion, that is one of the hardest questions in fantasy this year.
It is a really hard question, because I keep going back and forth on it. Like, I wouldn't be shocked by pretty much any outcome, because you got the Tank Dell shower narrative of them like they're best friends. He wanted the Texans to draft Tank Dell. I wouldn't be shocked if he led this team in receiving. I wouldn't be shocked if Stephon Diggs looks exactly like the Stephon Diggs we've seen for the last 8 years, and he leads this team in receiving. I wouldn't be shocked if the writing was on the wall and all the nerds were right, and Nico Collins is the guy that you need, and he's a top 5 receiver this year. I wouldn't be shocked if none of them really achieve their ADP, because they all cannibalize each other either. So their situation is one that I really am interested in. The other guy that I want to mention quickly before we talk about kind of like just guys that you're drafting, I just want to ask you a couple guys there. And maybe this is one of them. We can dovetail right into the conversation. But Chris Olave is number 2 on this list at 2021, or since 2021, in expected fantasy points lost to deep targets. And to me, he's the prototypical, this stuff isn't sticky year over year, because I know that Derek Carr has been a good deep passer in years past. And I don't think Derek Carr is a good quarterback. And also, full disclosure, I'm a Tampa Bay Buccaneers fan. I can't stand the New Orleans Saints. I absolutely hate this team. But Chris Olave is a dominant downfield route runner. He's a dominant downfield wide receiver. And week 2 of his rookie season, I got to see him firsthand get missed left, right, and center by Jameis Winston down the field. So I know exactly what this stat is pointing to. but there's been seasons in Derek Carr's career. In 2020, he was top 10 in deep completion percentage. In 2018, he was top 6 in deep completion percentage. He is definitely capable of running hotter on deep targets than he did last year. He also, I feel like, had a broken back, a concussion, and 3 bruised ribs in every single game. So he's one of these guys where I look at Chris Olave, natural progression from year 2 to year 3. We already know this guy's a stud. He's proven it in 2 years in the NFL. He's the one dude that I'm like, if you project him and you sit down and you look at it and you're like, man, he's going to come out really good. But part of you is like, I don't want to draft a guy from this offense. I don't want to draft a guy from the Saints. They're probably going to be like a low scoring team or whatever, but there's reason for optimism schematically with Clint Kubiak coming in, and then also just them running hotter and Chris Olave just being so much better in year 3 than he was in year 1 and 2, because it wasn't that long ago that we used to think year 3 wide receivers were the shit, and that's all we ever wanted in fantasy football. So I don't know if this is one of your dudes, you can dovetail into it. If it's not, let me know what your thoughts are on Olave, and if he, because I go back and forth with Danny all the time. Does this guy actually have like a super elite ceiling, or is he just destined to finish wide receiver 8 to 16? Like we're all kind of expecting, I guess, with his ADP right now.
Yeah, he wasn't one of my guys, but yeah, happy to talk about him for sure. So I actually don't know if this made it into the final draft of the article. I don't believe so. But if you just take Olave's finishes last year or his per game averages, and if let's say you just add on all those expected fantasy points lost to those uncatchable deep targets, you get it pretty much exactly to his ADP on Underdog right now, which is like wide receiver 11, wide receiver 12. That's about exactly what he would have averaged, right? So I'm fine with Olave there. I think he's a fine pick. I think really the bull case for Olave is Clint Kubiak coming in as the OC for the Saints, just adding in all of this additional motion and play action. I think it was Rich Rebar who I heard talk about this first, but the Saints were bottom 5 in both of those categories last year in terms of motion and play action. Those are 2 of the biggest cheat codes for just passing production overall in the NFL. And just seeing that get up anywhere even close to league average is going to make all the difference for your Chris Olaves, for your Rashid Shaheeds. So yeah, I think there's reason to be slightly optimistic about this offense. So if that's like the push you needed to click the button on Chris Olave at the wide receiver 11, wide receiver 12, I'm fine with that. If that's the push you needed, consider it given.
Yeah, he's almost the opposite of Nico in terms of what types of leagues I'm in on Olave, because I think in home leagues he'll go lower than he goes on Underdog, because we know Underdog is just thirsty for wide receivers, and his ADP is like 7 spots higher on Underdog. It's like wide receiver, like 14th overall or 15th overall in ADP. Whereas in home leagues, I find myself often you can get him at the 2-3 turn, and I feel pretty good about that price tag on Chris Olave. I'm like, yeah, that's definitely something that I could feel good about, because there's also the upside that like, this guy's a good enough player to post like a 3.0 yards per route run season if Derek Carr gives him quality quarterback play. 2 last guys I just wanted to point to, because I've been thinking about this too. I am not the biggest Jaden Daniels fan as a quarterback, as a passing quarterback. Obviously, from a fantasy perspective, I love him because he can run the ball. But man, Terry McLaurin is starting to scream at me a little bit in this thing, because if there's one thing that Jaden Daniels can do, it's throw the ball downfield. And if Terry McLaurin's the definition of one of these guys that you feel like should have been better, because he commands the targets. He performs well in the things that nerds like, but he doesn't score as many fantasy points as we want him to. Like, the guy's legit been like a wide receiver 3 in fantasy his whole career. And we all assume he should be better than that based on how good he is. So he's one of these guys that I think, like, do I believe Jaden Daniels going to be an awesome passer in his rookie season? Maybe not, but if he's just at least a better deep passer than Sam Howell and whatever other bunch of slappies have been thrown to Terry McLaurin the last couple of years, it would be an interesting development, I think, for his fantasy value too.
Yeah, Terry McLaurin almost got his own blurb in the article. I agree. If you are in on Terry McLaurin and his skill set, if you've been a Terry McLaurin guy throughout his career, this should be your season, right? Like, it's the cheapest he's ever been, pretty much. And yeah, there's a lot of potential positive variance here with Daniels coming in, just knowing that McLaurin has gotten relatively unlucky on those uncatchable deep targets in the recent past. Yeah, if you are a believer in the talent of Terry McLaurin, I agree, you should be going after him. I've never been a huge Terry McLaurin believer. I've never been super impressed by what he's put out, certainly on the stat sheets, but even on the field, he's never quite popped out to me as much as I think he has to some other people. At least like 3 years ago. I feel like 3 years ago, Terry McLaurin was like the film guy's darling. Now everyone's kind of forgotten and left him for dead at this point. But yeah, maybe he changes that. Maybe he bounces back and kind of shows everybody what they've been missing.
Yeah, and again, he's one of these guys that I'm not touching with 10-foot pole on Underdog because he goes at like 45 overall, and I'm like, there's no way I would take him that high. But in home leagues, people are a little sick of him, so that's why I'm like, maybe he's got an edge there, like round 6, round 7, kind of like Mike Evans last year, where we kind of wrote off Mike Evans, and we're like, you know what, we know he's a good receiver, but we're not sure about the quarterback play. We're not sure about, like, you know, he hasn't had a spike season in a while, and I think it wouldn't totally shock me if Terry McLaurin had a nice year. And then last one, you don't even have to comment on this because it's so disgusting, but Odell Beckham being the 3rd most expected fantasy points lost to uncontested deep targets. And then, like you said, going to an offense where they're historically going to overperform in that category with the Miami Dolphins, and Tua also like an exceptional deep passer too. So he's one that I'm like, there's no way I would touch him in a managed league, but I will take 18th round Odell Beckham Jr.
Oh yeah, no, this was you're mind reading me on all the things I almost wrote in this article that I was too scared to say. But yeah, Odell Beckham in the 18th round. Are you kidding me? There are so many worse 18th round picks you can make than Odell.
I have 22% J.K. Dobbins right now, and he has literally he has a torn Achilles. Like, if I'm doing that, I feel like I should be taking one of the best offensive schemes in the NFL, and probably the best, like the team that has the biggest advantage over, like, as much as this is a 49ers scheme, I actually think McDaniel might run it better than Shanahan runs it, at least as far as like people overperforming kind of their expectations and making good on every target and every touch that they get. That's basically the entire case for Devon Achane right now. So segment number 3 of this thing, I just want to get you to rattle off some players that you're targeting. It could be at wide receiver. I mean, we talked about wide receivers this entire time, but it could be at any other position as well. I'll let you do like a top 5 your guys based either on this article or just in general.
Yeah, we can start with the wide receivers. So I'll say Amari Cooper is someone who really pops out, especially in this catchable target research. So last year, Cooper had 6 games where there was a combination of Dorian Thompson-Robinson and PJ Walker throwing him the ball. In those games, a 63% catchable target rate. That was 2nd worst in the league. Averaged just 7.9 fantasy points per game in those games. But outside of those games, so either with Deshaun Watson or with Joe Flacco, he had a completely normal, completely average catchable target rate, 20 fantasy points per game out of Amari Cooper in those games. So that would have been 6th best among all wide receivers. Obviously, he is being drafted much later than that. I've been all over Cooper all offseason. Even as he's risen on Underdog, I'm still taking him. He's going to be an insane value in home leagues as well. He's definitely one of those guys where I think like the home league type of people are kind of sick of him. It's whatever. It's Amari Cooper. Unless they had him in week 15 last year. Maybe then
I feel like he's actually a home league darling a little bit. Two things I would push back on Amari Cooper, because like you actually wrote this article, so I'm like using this against you. I'm killing you with your own weapon here. He's entering year 10, which scares me a little bit, because Amari Cooper is totally the type of person to me that would fall off out of nowhere, that we would never expect it coming, and he would just fall off again. We've seen absolutely no evidence of that. He had a good year last year, wide receiver like 17 in points per game, but he's the type of guy that I feel like could just fall off a cliff one season, and I wouldn't be totally shocked by that. And also too, like, if you extend the sample of him playing with Deshaun Watson back to 2022, when Jacoby Brissett wasn't the starter there and Watson was, his points per game total goes down to like 13.5. So while he underperformed in this like catchable target stuff, he's not playing with Joe Flacco for 17 games this year, at least the Joe Flacco that we saw at the end of last season. So I'm like, is Deshaun Watson like going to get back to Deshaun Watson play? Because if he does, like, I'd be all over Cooper myself too. But he's one of those guys where I'm just like, yeah, sure. Like, he's fine. I'm not in and I'm not out. Like, he's just totally one of those guys for me.
Sure. So, I mean, I'll push back on you with, with the stuff in those articles. So yeah, I mean, even with Deshaun Watson last year, 5 games, 17.6 fantasy points per game, obviously not quite what we saw with Flacco, but certainly would still be far beating his ADP. Right. And in terms of the age stuff, I try not to like over predict the decline, especially at the wide receiver position.
Right.
Just because when guys are still efficient, which Amari Cooper was last year, it's just really hard for me to sit here and say, yeah, this is going to be the exact season. I'm going to call it, because it's very rarely a smooth decline with these guys. It's usually they're totally good, totally usable in fantasy one year, and then the next they are just completely unusable. Cooper just doesn't give me that impression at all based on what he put on the field last year. And also, yeah, sure, it's year 10, but this is only his age 30 season, right? Forever,
he's been 22 for 7 years.
Exactly.
It's totally vibes. It's a total vibes take for me. I don't like to make vibes takes very often, but Amari Cooper potentially falling off this year is my vibes take of the year.
Okay. Yeah, no, I gotcha. But yeah, I just age 30. For wide receivers, it's usually age 31, age 32 when we see like the steeper drop off significantly below the career average. I'll probably have the chronological based age stuff in this year's version of age curves coming out. I hope to God at some point before the season. We'll see how that goes for me. But yeah, so I am not at all concerned about the age stuff with Cooper. So that is part of the reason why I feel really confident with him.
Yeah, and I'm not that concerned. I just push back on it a little bit because it's one thing that my gut is telling me is like a stupid reason to fade somebody, and I'll probably bite it later for that. So who else do you like this year other than Cooper?
Yeah, so I am crazy about Deontay Johnson this year. I swear to God, I have not been a Deontay Johnson person the last couple of years. I've been told that this is like a yearly Joker moment from a few people in the industry that
I would be one of them.
Yeah, every summer we get really into Deontay Johnson and it never works out for us. So either I join that club this year or I get on the train at the right time, right? So last year, Johnson's depth adjusted catchable target rate ranked 8th worst. What is really important for Deontay Johnson is the intermediate game. He sees most of his targets between 10 and 19 yards. And on those intermediate throws, he kind of dominated the entire NFL, right? He averaged the most yards per catchable target on those throws, right? Between 10 and 19 yards. But unfortunately, he had the worst catchable target rate in the league at that depth among all qualifying wide receivers. And this isn't even just like a Kenny Pickett thing. Somehow George Pickens did okay in catchable target rate on these throws. It was just very specifically a Deontay Johnson getting really unlucky thing. Now put him in with year 2 Bryce Young, who was able to give some accurate intermediate depth targets to Adam Thielen in particular last year. Get this offense running through this Dave Canales system where he has just turned bad QBs into at least average to mediocre QBs every year the past few years. It's kind of unbelievable what this man keeps doing. So I am super into Deontay Johnson as the by far the most likely to benefit from the Canales effect, from a hopefully slightly better showing in year 2 from Bryce Young, and just from he can't get any less lucky on these intermediate targets where he has always kind of made his living.
Yeah, so if I had a nickel for every should I buy Bryce Young question I've gotten in Dynasty, and if I had a nickel for every time I've answered, I don't fucking know. Honestly, like Bryce Young is the Houston Texans wide receiver core of Dynasty quarterbacks, because I'm like, I can see both outcomes because I loved Bryce Young coming out. I thought he was the best quarterback in the class, but then I looked like an idiot after year 1. But I understand the scheme was bad, but then also as a Buccaneers fan, I also understand that Dave Canales is not really the sharpest dude in the world, but he does do good work with quarterbacks. So it's difficult, man. I feel good about Deontay Johnson this year at his price point. But I also have had an egg on my face from Deontay Johnson a couple times. So I'm cautiously optimistic on him and his price point, but I definitely have mixed him in as well.
All right. And then my third guy, the last receiver on my list, of course, is Christian Watson. Anyone who follows me on Twitter is probably sick of hearing me talk about Christian Watson, but I'm going to keep doing it until his ADP goes up, and then maybe I'll decide to shut up. So I already talked about kind of the huge difference just in terms of catchable target rate between him and someone like Romeo Doubs, someone like Jaden Reed, catching targets from the same quarterback. Jordan Love came in and outplayed Aaron Rodgers, what Aaron Rodgers did in Watson's rookie season, but somehow Watson's catchable target rate fell from 77% to 68%, which was third worst in the league last year. And look, we know exactly what Christian Watson is capable of. This is the guy that came in as a rookie and had a top 10 yards per route run among rookie wide receivers over the past decade. Like, forget the touchdown production. I don't even care about that. He was just insanely efficient as a rookie. Last year, he had 2 games where he looked healthy. It was his last 2 games of the season before he was out for the year again, and he was awesome in them, right? So I just am going to buy into this narrative of Watson went and got his hamstring asymmetry checked out. It's the Alvin Kamara corollary from last year. It's a medical miracle. They've figured out he has less muscle mass in one leg, and they're going to get it straightened out. Maybe he stays healthier based on that medical science, which is really exciting. Because, yeah, if he does stay healthy, this is a Packers offense I'm excited about, that I want to be buying pieces of, that at least one of these pieces is going to overperform in fantasy, right? It's this very ambiguous wide receiver core. Nobody really knows who the target dominator is going to step up and be. We have seen Christian Watson be a target dominator for a stretch of time in his rookie season and be a fringe fantasy wide receiver 1 in fantasy points per game, right? So I just believe he has the highest upside. He is significantly cheaper than a Jaden Reed, and he has all of this positive regression on the catchable targets coming his way. So I'm drafting a ton of Christian Watson, and it's going to be very hard to ever argue me out of this year.
Oh yeah, we're in lockstep. I have a hard time clicking Jaden Reed at the 4-5 turn where he goes right now. Like I like Jaden Reed, and I really liked Jaden Reed as a prospect. Like I don't think a lot of people would find somebody higher than on Jaden Reed than I was. Like I had him as like a top 6 receiver in the class. His grade was neck and neck with Quentin Johnston's at wide receiver 5, and not many people would have said those guys were comparable as prospects coming out. But I loved his film. I loved the separation ability that he had. It's just that like, he's also one of these guys where I'm like, I think Jaden Reed ran really hot, man. And I feel like Christian Watson, when he's healthy, has a chance to actually dominate the targets there. Like you kind of made reference to, and people want to get cute all day. Like, oh, it's Dontavian Wicks is the wide receiver 1 there. And it's like, maybe, but I don't really think that's likely of happening. I think we would have more indication from the team that they actually expected that. Like Jordan Love can say that he expects a huge year from him, but like, what else is he going to say? Like, he's not going to say anything else. He's going to say, yeah, Dontavian Wicks sucks. Like he's going to be terrible this year. Like Christian
Watson,
Watson,
Dontavian Wicks to run a 40% route share this year. Just like
yeah, that would be great. Actually, that would be really helpful if Jordan Love did say that.
If you're listening, Jordan Love, please just tell us what route shares you expect out of all your receivers next time a reporter asks you, please.
The preseason game logs in the first Packers preseason game is going to be cracking my veins just to get an idea of who played with the starters. And I already know Matt LaFleur is just going to fuck with us and put Jordan Love out there for 15 snaps and play each of these receivers for 5 of them.
Yeah, that sounds about right. I'm looking forward to preseason depth chart tilt season to preseason route share tilt season. That I forget about that like every July that it's coming. It's getting close.
When I've been putting out videos since January, I need new shit to talk about by mid-August.
Yes.
So I actually love that stuff just because I'm like, okay, the angle and the narrative has changed on these players. I can talk about something other than their reception perception profile and their yards per route run the previous season. So I feel pretty good about that. So you mentioned those are the 3 wide receivers. Any backs, any QBs, any tight ends that you're hammering this year?
Yeah, I mean, I've got a couple running backs here. First, we're going to go back to the Dave Canales well, and I would raise you Jonathan Brooks, and I would say, imagine the Rachaad White role last year, but for a running back that we actually think is a good runner, right? Doesn't that sound exciting? Why are we not more
Can
excited
confirm
about
Rachaad
this?
White can't run the ball as a Bucs fan.
His rush yards, and not that I super put a ton of stock into running back efficiency stats or whatever, but Rachaad White's just rush yards over expected was ghastly last year, right? It's just, and you can see that watching the game too. But look, Jonathan Brooks in college, as soon as Bijan Robinson leaves, he kind of did the Bijan Robinson thing for his last season in college. For 1 year, he was 91st percentile in college missed tackles forced per touch, was just as productive as Bijan pretty much, was used a little bit more through the air. He has this every down bell cow profile that has become so rare in the NFL, has become so rare in fantasy. We have like 3 guys who we think are going to do that this year. They're all going in the first round. And then we have Jonathan Brooks here that you can get in like round 5 or round 6. And it just doesn't make sense to me. I want to draft all the Jonathan Brooks. I don't care if he is brought on a little bit slowly, coming back from the ACL, which, by the way, we've heard absolutely nothing concerning about that, unless I missed a blurb right before we came on. But it sounds like Brooks is going to be ready for the start of the season. I'm sure they'll ease him in a little bit, but guess what? The most important weeks in fantasy football are whether it's underdog or your home league is the end of the season. It is weeks 15 through 17. It's not weeks 1, 2, and 3. So I am all in on Jonathan Brooks. I'm going to have an absolutely irresponsible exposure to him this year because he's just one of the only players that late that I can see both being good and being efficient and also just getting this insane 3-down workload.
As a guy who led the charge for I will draft Breece Hall every single goddamn time last year, I concur, because Breece Hall was coming off of an ACL tear and he was a 4th round pick. And obviously we had seen him in the NFL and we knew he was a great player. But I mean, Jonathan Brooks in our prospect model from a dynasty perspective was an RB1 upside prospect comparable to Dalvin Cook, Alvin Kamara, Derrick Henry, Rashad Penny, DeAndre Swift, Zach Charbonnet, Cam Akers, and Antonio Gibson. So, I mean, we're talking about a dude that was legit, and I'm uniquely qualified to answer this Rachaad White versus Jonathan Brooks conundrum because I'm also a Texas Longhorns fan in addition to being a Buccaneers fan.
Oh, wow. Look at that.
So this is like Rachaad White. I'll give him this. Our offensive line interior wise was terrible and it's going to be better this year. So I am a little bit more not too worried about the ghastly rush yards over expected from his perspective this year. But yeah, Jonathan Brooks running behind an offensive line that they bolstered in free agency with 2 big guard additions in Carolina. They have a quarterback who will be willing to throw him the football, and he's a great receiver, as I saw during his time at Texas too. So yeah, I'm in on Jonathan Brooks. I don't think I'm like overexposed to him, and I'm kind of regretting it a little bit. But maybe I'll get lucky and we'll get him put on PUP to start training camp, and he'll drop like 10 picks in ADP, and I'll just hammer the crap out of him at pick 95 or wherever he'd be going at that point.
Yeah, the but he's on PUP season is also coming. Man,
yep.
I'm just
Mike Williams got put on PUP today. That's coming.
Oh, okay, all right, yeah. Maybe that'll be interesting. Find a reason to draft Mike Williams for me. Can't wait for that. But anyways, my last guy here that I want to talk about is Devon Achane. So I've just been beating the Devon Achane drum all off season. So he just had the most efficient rookie season ever by a running back. By a ton of different measures, by like your yards after contact or missed tackles forced or whatever. Even if you just put his fantasy points per game against his expected fantasy points per game or his weighted opportunity, he outperformed that by over 6 fantasy points per game, which is unbelievable. And if you look at recent history, rookie running backs drafted rounds 1 through 3 that outperformed their weighted opportunity by at least 2.5, so way less than Achane did. There's only 5 of those guys over the last several years. All 5 of them had a big volume increase in year 2, and 4 out of 5 of them went over 20 fantasy points per game in year 2. The only one who didn't was Todd Gurley being stuck in the Jeff Fisher offense in year 2. And he promptly broke fantasy football as soon as Sean McVay got there the following year. So my whole point, this is a long-winded way of saying Devon Achane is very likely an incredibly special talent that we very rarely see enter the league. And any concerns about him not having that much volume or he's going to regress in touchdowns or whatever, it just sounds like the people who said that same thing about Alvin Kamara after his rookie season. Remember when he was splitting with Mark Ingram? That's Raheem Mostert is Mark Ingram in Alvin Kamara's rookie season, right? That's what these people are going to sound like. And look, fine, I'll take my shots on Raheem Mostert in best ball or whatever. He just scored 21 touchdowns. I get that. That's a completely separate bet that is, I think, is totally fine to make. But look, that shouldn't be the reason you don't want to draft Devon Achane. Is 33-year-old Raheem Mostert, who was old and injured and washed like 3 years ago or so, we thought, right? So I am just hammering Achane there. I will do it in the second round. I don't care. Especially in home leagues, I'll do it in the second round. Happy to do that. Even in underdog, I don't care about your structural drafting. Devon Achane is the type of player that you should structure your draft strategy around. I don't care about your structural draft takes. I can't draft running backs early because of the wide receiver avalanche this year. Achane is the reason that you take an off ramp to that.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So me and Danny go back and forth on Achane because he is a little higher on Achane than me, but he's my RB7 and my 22nd overall player. So I'm also like extremely high on him relative to like where the market in home leagues especially will be. I found out a couple of weeks ago that I have the 3rd pick in my home league draft. So I'm hoping I can pair Tyreek Hill with a wide receiver on the way back, and Ayuk, a Collins, an Olave, somebody like that, and then grab Achane in round 3 to kick it off. And that would be a beautiful start to my draft. But the only thing I worry about with Achane is the fact that he's 188 pounds. Like, even if he could handle a volume increase, it's not quite the most likely thing for, like, I'm sure the list of players that you have are like Alvin Kamara, David Johnson, Todd Gurley, those guys, like, they have the mass to be able to carry a big workload. And I get it. It's a different NFL. It's like Mike McDaniel's the one guy that would know how to use this guy properly. The semantics of it, I'm becoming less enamored with. Like, I'm just not as worried about them anymore. I'm like, yeah, maybe his like absolute ceiling is 220 carries and he has, 75 receptions, and that's how he gets there. Like, I'm not really super concerned anymore about the semantics of his size. I worry that it is going to limit him to some degree. It's like, but if he's still an 18 point per game scorer instead of a 22 point per game scorer, you're probably still quite happy with that draft pick.
Absolutely, yeah. And I mean, there was a photo of him going around back in like March or April where he looked like he had bulked up a lot. I mean, this guy was a track athlete also throughout college, right? And
he also was a workhorse in college, even though he shouldn't have been given his size.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But I think he said in an interview at one point, yeah, I haven't really been able to do all this weight training and bulk up a lot because of track until this point in my life. So if he bulks up, if he puts on 10 pounds, suddenly he's pushing like 200, then yeah, he can do that. He can handle getting up. Yeah, I think he'll be fine.
Yeah, like I said, I was kind of like stringent, like, oh man, it's so hard to draft him over like Isaiah Pacheco and ETN, who just project as these like stud young running backs who are going to command big workloads. But like, dude, like Devon Achane, just like give him like 4 more touches a game and he could break fantasy football. So even if he literally has like 11 carries and 7 targets a game, I feel pretty confident he's going to be a top 5 running back. So yeah, I'm definitely with you on Achane. Danny definitely got me off the ledge on that one for sure.
Yeah. And I mean, he was pretty close to that like breaking fantasy football territory last year. It's just that nobody knew exactly when to start him. But all that has to happen is that becomes more consistent. He becomes naturally in year 2, like the go-to clear starter every week. And suddenly you're getting all of those spike weeks in your lineup. And yeah, of course, in best ball, we don't even care about this.
Yeah, no, literally. Yeah. Best ball, definitely not a worry. So Ryan, I'm apologizing to you formally right now because I told you it'd only be 30 to 40 minutes, but I feel like we were in a good flow and got some guys that you drafted, got some good information from me. So I really appreciate you coming on. And also make sure to check out the article. It is 100% free, I believe. I have a Fantasy Point subscription, so I can't remember if it's free or not, but I do.
It's free, yes.
Yeah, it is free to read. And the statistically significance, if you want to, because I actually haven't even read the other ones. I've seen them, like I've seen you tweet them out, but this is the only one that I've actually read so far. So if you want to plug upcoming ones or ones that are already live on the site, you can go ahead and do that too, because I think those are all really interesting so far.
Absolutely, yeah. So this one we've been talking about is statistically significant catchable targets. I have a ton of other ones, but probably the ones I would recommend the most are statistically significant first downs per route run. That's kind of going into like an alternative to yards per route run, giving you an idea of how guys win on a more consistent route to route basis versus in yards per route run, where a few big plays can kind of skew guys' numbers. So that was a really fun and interesting article to write, talking about a stat that's a little bit different, that isn't quite as popular. So yeah, would super recommend that one. And I'd also recommend my article on missed tackles forced, because I just kind of have a bone to pick with how a lot of the industry uses that stat specifically. And I think that was kind of just my short manifesto on what I think the stat can actually tell you and the correct way to use it. So yeah, would highly recommend those two articles in particular. Both of them also have a ton of targets, a ton of actionable fantasy takeaways, players you should draft if that's the type of thing you're looking for. I try to get a good balance of both nerdy stat stuff and actual what do I do in fantasy, which players do I draft, Ryan, in every article I write. So you can check all of those out on fantasypoints.com. Just type in statistically significant fantasy points. You'll find the landing page for them probably. And yeah, those are 100% free. And yeah, thanks so much for having me on, man. This was really fun. We went a long time, but I know I always expect to go over because I talk a lot. I understand I'm very verbose, so it was a great conversation and was happy to spend the extra time.
Yeah, for sure. And I actually have read the first downs per route run thing. You know, the reason I know that is because it's in my wide receiver prospect model. It's 5% of the prospect's total grade. I thought it was groundbreaking, and it makes just total logical sense that a wide receiver who's good will command a lot of first downs because he'll catch the ball consistently. He'll be able to do something with it after the catch. He'll get a lot of targets. And to know that it's a good stat, it's got to perform well. And Marvin Harrison and Malik Neighbors are the top two receivers in this class in career first downs per route run. Ironically, Ladd McConkey is number 3 in that stat. So that is an interesting one from this class. And the all-time leader since 2016 in the prospect model is one Tyreek Hill, who was a 6th round pick. So also spotted a nice sleeper using that stat as well. So yeah, appreciate you coming on. Again, there's no promotion going on here. Just full disclosure to the audience. No, Fantasy Points didn't pay me to do this. I just thought this was good work that was being done. And I talked about Scott Barrett's article about the coaching changes already. Talked about your age curves article last year and a little bit this year as well. I just like rewarding good work. So appreciate you coming on. Keep doing what you're doing because I love data stuff. And I feel like you and Dwayne and some of the other data nerds in the space are what keep me going from an article standpoint. I'm not a huge writer myself. I like to make video content, obviously, but I do appreciate a good written data content article. So appreciate it.
Yeah. Thanks again so much. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, of course. So those of you guys watching at home, hopefully you stuck around to the end. Like the video if you enjoyed, subscribe, make sure to follow Ryan over on Twitter and check out his work on Fantasy Points. And of course, if you want any other bonus content, flockfantasy.com, promo code FSE for 30% off and a 7-day free trial for rankings, draft guides, all the content that I've kind of made reference to. Both of our prospect models are available over there as well. Link down below for that in the description. If you want to take any of this advice right into Underdog too, and get some Christian Watson exposure, some Jonathan Brooks exposure, whatever you want to do. And when you sign up on Underdog, make sure to use promo code FSE and you'll get up to $250 in bonuses when you sign up, as well as a special pick'em. And you'll actually get our draft guide, both Dynasty and Redraft, totally for free when you sign up with our promo code. So definitely check that out if you're interested. But with that being said, peace out. We'll talk to you soon.